Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian McCrone with NBC10 Digital in Philadelphia. For the next hour, four of Philadelphia's top urban policy experts will explore a post-pandemic future. We'll look at how the lockdown has changed our cities already and what advancements will reshape education, small business, housing, and design. For every crisis, there comes achievements. So with that optimism, let's dive right in. Our experts come from Drexel University's Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation. Bruce Katz, Lucy Kerman, Kevin Gillen, and Harris Steinberg. Let's hear from the panelists.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bruce Katz. I run a finance lab at the Lindy Institute named in honor of Jeremy Nowak, who started the Reinvestment Fund in Philadelphia.
Kevin Gillen, I'm an economist with the Lindy Institute. I publish a regular quarterly report on the state of the city and region's housing market. My areas of research are in the fields of urban economics, public finance, and local and regional economic development strategies.
Hi, I'm Lucy Kerman. I'm the Senior Vice Provost for University and Community Partnerships at Drexel University. My work is to connect our university to the communities around our campus. I'm going to be talking today about education, but we also work in workforce and small business development and health and wellness, nutrition, arts and culture, all the different ways that we can connect our faculty, our students, and our business offices to this community.
Good afternoon, I'm Harris Steinberg. It's great to be here. Thank you, Brian, for inviting us. I direct the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation. I'm an architect and a planner in Philadelphia. Many of you may know the work along the Central Delaware, which I did a number of years ago while at Penn, and now here at Drexel. We have a number of big projects we're working on with partners on either side of the campus, Schuylkill Yards as well as UCD Square, and I work with Lucy and a number of others on helping the administration think through those issues. I have had the pleasure of not only working on some large-scale planning projects along the riverfronts, but also within our park systems, and I think you'll hear from me about those today.
Thanks, everyone. So the format for the hour is simple. We're going to look at how the lockdown has changed our lives so far. Then we'll delve into what the post-pandemic future might look like. And at the end, we'll also have time to take some questions from viewers. So send us your questions in the comment sections, whether you're watching us on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. So let's get started. Bruce, I'd like to start with your expertise in small business. I know you've been working with Congress, so the U.S. Senate, I think in particular. Could you talk a little bit about that and explain, and also could you explain like the scope of what we're talking about in Philadelphia when it comes to small business and minority small businesses?
Absolutely. So small business in the United States is a very broad segment of our economy. It's defined as establishments with less than 500 employees. I would say most of the people watching this would probably think that's quite odd. Aren't we really talking about establishments with less than, say, 20 employees or 10 employees? There are about 30 million small businesses in the U.S. The great bulk of them actually are these establishments with less than 20 employees. And essentially what the Congress did early on was recognize that this crisis had moved from being a public health crisis to being a small business crisis. And it enacted some very large interventions, particularly running through the Small Business Administration and financial institutions, the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. It became fairly apparent early on, both for the country and for Philadelphia, that these federal interventions were not touching the smallest of the small businesses or many Black-owned or Latino-owned businesses, which tend to be disproportionately sole proprietorships or establishments with 1 to 4 or 1 to 10 employees. So what we've been doing at the Nowak Lab and the Lindy Institute is working with Senator Cory Booker and a very diverse group of Democratic and Republican senators and Democratic and Republican House members to fashion an intervention that would provide direct assistance to city, counties, and states that would support either through grants or through zero interest loans, the smallest of the small businesses, particularly minority-owned businesses. So that was introduced yesterday, and we'll see if it manages its way into the next legislative package.
Lucy, I'd like to talk a little bit about the access to the internet in Philadelphia, and I want to get your take on how virtual learning is working so far.
Yeah, so, this crisis really exposed disparities that we really knew about, but it really brought them to the fore and has exacerbated them. And I think when you think about digital access, you really need to think about a couple of things. One of them is computers and access to computers, access to the internet, and then internet speed. So when the school district closed down, there was an immediate recognition that a significant number of children in Philadelphia could not continue their learning because they didn't have either computers or digital access. And there was a huge effort on the part of the school district and philanthropy, and wonderful people stepped forward to purchase Chromebooks that were given out. Now, it took weeks and weeks before that was able to happen. There was a lot of organizing that had to happen. And about 64%, the district tells us, of the children in the school district needed to get Chromebooks. It's complicated because in some cases it was families that got a Chromebook, and in other cases it was actually individual children. But you could imagine that a family with 3 or 4 children that gets one Chromebook, those kids are going to be at a real disadvantage in terms of learning. So one of the challenges we've seen, and it's become worse, is just access to computers. The challenges around internet access and internet speed are huge. And although Comcast has absolutely stepped up, they're offering 2 months of free access, we anticipate that the need for remote learning for these children is going to go through the summer and likely into some kind of hybrid in the fall. How are these families going to be able to afford internet access? How are they going to be able to afford speed that allows the children to really study and to download and to really work at the rate that suburban children are able to do? It's been a real challenge. We know that there are a significant number of children that have not yet connected to the internet. We have a Chromebook, but the family is having trouble doing that. And of course, the last thing is that getting a Chromebook in the house is one thing, learning how to use it and getting online in order to learn is yet another. So we're seeing that in the K-8 space in particular, less than half of the kids are actually checking in. And of course, in those younger grades, for a child to get on the internet and learn means their parent has to get them on the internet, because no first grader is going to get on themselves. So we have these compounding problems of how children and their families can get on the internet, can get the learning. And I think it's a significant challenge.
Kevin, how are let's look at home ownership and the residential development, and how are renters and owners feeling, and what are their main concerns right now?
Anxiety and trepidation. Up until the pandemic hit, we actually had a pretty good winter for our housing market. Because if you recall, it may seem like a lifetime ago, but we had a very mild weather this winter, and so foot traffic and thus sales was up quite strongly. It's one of the strongest winters on record. Prices steady, but sales, as you can imagine, plunged in March once, of course, the lockdown and the self-quarantining began. I know that among landlords, they're very concerned right now about a lot of the legislation that Philadelphia City Council is considering that's going to make evictions more difficult as well as lengthier. And there is also concern over the rent control bill. The rent control bill is being sponsored under the rationale that will be just for the duration of the pandemic. But a lot of landlords know that New York implemented rent control during World War II, and it was meant to be temporary as well. So there's concern that we, among landlords and developers, that we could see New York-style rent control here. And while that legislation may be well-intentioned, rent control, does create some issues in the market in terms of inequities of winners and losers, as well as providing a disincentive to maintain existing properties as well as build new ones. So I know there is some concern about that. That said, our housing market has held up fairly well so far. But remember, housing markets, like all real estate markets, move rather slowly. I think this is insofar there's a silver lining to this cloud, I think it would be a great time for the city to reconsider the nature of its tax structure. As I often like to say, Philadelphia's problem isn't just that it taxes too much, it taxes the wrong things. the city is heavily reliant on wage, business, and sales taxes as opposed to property or real estate taxes, which is the main source of revenue for most municipalities. And that's an issue because property values are much more stable over time than those other things. And, as soon as the self-quarantining began, businesses were closed, business revenue plummeted, wage tax revenue plummeted, sales tax revenue plummeted, but property values have held up. And I think the city should really reconsider, rebalancing its tax structure away from those very volatile and mobile sources of revenue and towards a more stable and more locally planted one, which is real estate.
Thanks. Harris, what is the lockdown teaching us about city planning?
So first of all, I think we have to look to history, and thanks for the question, Brian. Histories have historically bounced back from pandemics. The plague in London in 1665 and the Great Fire in 1666 actually influenced how William Penn planned Philadelphia. His original concept in 1681 and then the first plan in 1682 was a direct result of lessons learned from those disasters. So you had brick houses. The brick row house is actually a public health response to a city planning challenge. You had green spaces for light and air as well as for refuge. So you have the squares as well as the original concept of the plan being big houses and big lots. So I think that's really important for us to understand that we do bounce back. We often respond with new knowledge and we create better cities. In Philadelphia, the yellow fever epidemic in the late 18th century and the early 19th century caused us to create the first municipal water supply system in the United States. The waterworks pumping water up to the reservoir where the art museum is right now, and then gravity feeding it to the city below was a marvel in its time. We then expanded that system to created Fairmount Park, 4,000 acres of essentially a working landscape that protects the water supply that still supplies 1 million people a day. So again, you can trace us back to the yellow fever epidemic and our not only water supply, but our public spaces. All right, moving forward, what have we learned? Couple of things, and we don't have any answers yet, but just certainly some observations and some questions. One of the first is this need for flexibility in public spaces. Who would have thought that essentially field hospitals would be set up in Central Park in New York? Nobody would ever have imagined that, and yet that's what we had. What's the corollary for Philadelphia? If we were to have that level of need, where do we have that kind of lay down space? So we've got to think about that. We've got to think about social distancing and how many people across the city don't have access to green space. We have a very large park system, but it's disproportionately spread out across the city. So you had many parts of the city that were penned up, trying to come to other parts of the city, and then you have issues of social distancing. So can we kind of expand our park system in a way that's flexible and connected so that someone living in the part of the city that doesn't have access to green space, and we know there's more than 200,000 who don't have access to a 10-minute walk to a green space, could actually get on some of the 70 miles of underused or vacant rail trails that could maybe connect our legacy watershed parks. These are just some of the kind of things that we're thinking about. The pandemic has raised issues of food insecurity, supply chain insecurity, housing insecurity. I think all of these become part of the city planning dialogue moving forward.
Yeah, let's take a look at now that we've established a little bit of a baseline. I'd love to look forward now and what's coming on as we've discussed previously. Bruce, you made a great point. It's the next phase of this crisis. We're not. It'd probably be too premature to look much farther than that. So, in the next phase, but moving forward into the latter part of the year, maybe even into 2021. I thought, Lucy, you oversee the relationships that Drexel has with the surrounding communities in West Philadelphia. Can you tell us a little bit about your current initiatives with your local schools and how these are changing through the pandemic?
Yeah, I listen to my colleagues, and they have, particularly Harris, has these sort of gestures to say, not only are we going to come out of this, but it's going to be great. I think it's hard to say what schools are going to look like. We talk a lot about building back better and what can we do that addresses some of the weaknesses, and we can certainly talk about that. But it is really hard to think about what does a K-12 system look like, even a hybrid K-12 system that is successful. Drexel has worked for many years. I've been there for almost 10 years with a number of our local schools, and we now work with 7 schools around our campus. We have a Department of Education Promised Neighborhoods grant. We've done a lot of deep work over the years with behavioral health and professional development for teachers, after school programming, parent support. During the pandemic, we've really sort of dug in. We have those relationships. So we've been able to hear from the principals. That's when we hear their children, the most vulnerable children, have not connected. They don't have their Chromebooks, they don't have internet access, and they're not showing up. So we're hearing some very troubling stories. We also, as part of our education work, have created a community advisory council of all the civic associations associated with the schools. So we are regularly talking to community leaders. We have Zoom calls, which are exhausting. But what we're hearing is they're not accessing their food. The families are really struggling. Many of them have lost their jobs. This is why something like adding internet access as a monthly charge becomes so problematic for these families, because they're already, in many cases, on the edge, and they have been hit hard by this. So we have really organized to provide support to teachers, to think about how we provide online learning supports. The teachers in the Philadelphia School District weren't ready to teach online. Teaching online isn't simply giving a lecture in front of a Zoom, particularly if you're talking to 4th graders. That's not going to be effective. And so we have the capacity in our School of Education to really work with the school district to think creatively about what does online instruction need to look like in the K-12 environment? And we're really thinking a lot about that. We've also been able to use our grant not only to buy cleaning supplies, masks, we're buying jump ropes, we're buying balls, we're getting them delivered into the neighborhood so the children have something to do. We're getting books, we're getting crayons. We're trying to manage the balance between online with what children need in their hands. And I think our big question now is, what do we do for summer camp? Children are not going to want to spend summer online learning. They've lost a lot of learning. The school was basically not building for about 2 months. They probably lost close to 6 months of learning. We need to focus on instruction and enrichment, but it can't simply be online, not for children, not in the summer. So we're thinking a lot with the out-of-school time providers that we work with to think about camp, got to do something. So that's part of what we're doing.
It sounds like it's even becoming is it becoming an even closer relationship than it was before?
Well, I think there's a lot of give and take. And yes, what we're finding is that people are coming with more and more questions and problems and more open to collaboration. Absolutely. And we're digging deeply across the university to try to solve different kinds of problems that are coming up. I do think that beginning to connect to the school district around what remote learning could look like and how we can be creative about it so that kids don't get totally zoomed out all the time. That's going to be a major piece of work. And again, what is K-4 instruction? What do you do for the 7-year-old online that can be enriching? We're gonna dig deep into the skills that we have as a university. We've been teaching online for a very long time, and we know that it's not just standing in front of a camera. You can do simulations, you can do a lot of things, and you can also send packets home to children that they can actually touch. So some combination of hybrid learning, we talk about that at Drexel. We're going to have to talk about that in terms of the school district too. And yes, I think we're having those very rich conversations.
Kevin, what kind of trends, as we said about the renting and the buying, and is there some good advice for particular segments of the market, say first-time homeowners? I'd love to hear what you. I think a lot of people would like to hear, the millennials versus other generations, the challenges they're facing versus the baby boomers and Gen X's.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of aspects to that. As Bruce has pointed out, the pandemic and recession, like all these things, fall hardest on the young, the least skilled, and the least educated. So they're the ones that, are being hit the worst. It's, making the poor poor, if you will. Right now, I can tell you, inventories in Philadelphia are historic lows. That is the number of homes listed for sale. Right now, we've got about a 2.6 month supply of homes for sale, meaning that if no homes were listed and current homes continue to sell at their current pace, our supply of homes available to buy would be exhausted in 2.6 months. To give you some context, in an average balanced market, a 5 to 7 month supply is considered normal. We've got a 2.6 month supply. So the what's available out there for home buyers is very, very low and very, very limited. So that makes it a seller's market. But of course, foot traffic is way down because of the quarantining, as well as just general risk aversion. Pennsylvania remains the only state in the country in which that does not allow in-person showing of homes. That is considered an essential business in all the other states. Some legislation has recently gotten out of the state Senate and House and has gone to Governor Wolf that will lift that restriction. So I know he's under some pressure to do that. He might have signed it already. I haven't. I know it got to his desk earlier this week. So that is being watched. That will certainly have a large impact on the market. Like I said, landlords are concerned about the possibility of a long-term regime of citywide rent control in the city. Regarding what I think house prices will do, our market's held up fairly well so far. We know that the recession will put some downward pressure on it. But as long as inventories remain low, which is supply, that will provide some upward support. Moreover, as I like to point out, I'm relatively more bullish on the residential sector than I am on the commercial sector. The office market has taken a big hit because they're not being occupied right now, and tenants don't want to pay rent if they're not using the space. I can also tell you that the suburban brokers are going to be mounting a major campaign to attract office tenants out of Center City to relocate to lower density, lower rent places like King of Prussia, on the assumption that it's a healthier place, it's a cheaper place, and moreover, their employees would feel more comfortable in a lower density setting than they would in a higher density one in Center City. So that's being watched. But as long as people are working from home, your home is no longer a place to live. It's now a place of business. It's a place to work. So that, again, will provide some upward support for house prices, even during a significant economic downturn and recession. Also, if I could play off what Harris pointed out earlier about the Spanish flu pandemic of 100 years ago, that hit Philadelphia especially hard. We were basically the New York of the last pandemic. We had 12,000 Philadelphians were killed by the pandemic. I mean, we're not even up to 1,000 yet today, knock wood. I certainly hope we don't hit 1,000, but we're still well below the death toll of the last one. But following that, the 1920s were one of the best decades ever, not only economically for Philadelphia, but also for housing. Philadelphia built more homes in the 1920s than it did in any decade prior to that. In fact, the median year of a home built in Philadelphia is 1925. That's our high watermark. We built more homes in 1925 than we ever had either before or since, even during the post-war boom and during the current boom. So, if history is any guide, I wouldn't count cities out yet, and I wouldn't count the housing market out yet either.
Well, just to expand off of what you mentioned, the downtown commercial market. What describe a little bit more about that? What do you think might happen? You mentioned like less density out in maybe where there's more space. I mean, there might be interest in that, or what might happen in the short term? What's even happening, now with that?
I can tell you, I did a presentation last week on the state of the market to a major industry association that's based in the western suburbs. I won't give away their name, but basically they represent all the commercial and residential real estate brokers in Montgomery, Chester, and Delaware counties. And I can tell you, these guys are salivating at the prospect of basically convincing Center City to relocate to King of Prussia and Exton and office parks in the western suburbs. They're going to be mounting a major campaign to woo tenants in Center City. Law firms paying $40 a square foot Class A rents to have all their support staff relocate to the burbs and just have the lawyers remain in the city because they need proximity to the courts. And anyone who doesn't have to be in Philadelphia, they're going to try to convince them that there are better places to go that are cheaper and a lower density and hence healthier.
But Kevin, isn't that the fear that that happened? People thought would happen in New York after 9/11.
Yeah,
there were some back office functions that left, but the city came back resurgent.
Yeah, as there's this whole, it seems every few years there's always some event that seems to necessitate the question: is this going to be the death of cities? Right? As you pointed out, There was the plague of London. 1 in 3 people were killed. What happened after that? London grew. Philadelphia got hit by the Spanish flu. 12,000 people died. What happened after that? Philadelphia grew. World War II devastated major cities. What happened after that? Those cities grew. I remember when the internet debuted, it was going to be, the end of cities because we're all going to work from home and telecommute and work virtually. What happened? Cities grew. 9/11 was supposed to be the end of cities because we didn't want to be in high density areas the targets of terrorist attacks. What happened? Cities grew. You see the pattern here?
But we can't be Pollyannish. I hear Lucy's admonition as well.
Well, it's just the education side that's in trouble, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
we got to figure it out, right? That's the goal.
Absolutely.
Bruce, what is your take on small business people come to cities? Not only do they live in cities for the businesses that are right around them and the restaurants that are right around them, but they also come into the cities from the suburbs and from the surrounding areas. So with what Kevin's saying in mind, how do small businesses cope with the rents? I mean, is that a big part of the troubles that they're going through right now?
Well, we've already experienced the loss of about 1 million small businesses in the United States. And because of the uncertainty about the reopen and the restart, with health protocols, with social distancing, with deep cleaning, many small businesses that have not collapsed are going to come back and say, now we have additional costs and less revenue, right? So this is not a rocket science. I think what's about to happen is that we're going to shift the conversation as we reopen from businesses to business districts, as Kevin was describing, and from financial products that are only geared to small businesses to places. Because what we love about cities are main streets, commercial corridors, the areas around universities, the downtown. And these places are going to be very hard hit. So our sense is we're going to have to reinvent how we manage places. We're going to have to create regenerators, not just incubators, accelerators, business improvement districts, community development corporations, regenerators that provide some kind of common service to small businesses, help on the rent, help on the deep cleaning, help on technology access. I am very worried in particular about what's going to happen in commercial corridors in low-income Black communities and Latino communities. I think we're going to see the rise of parasitic capital, predatory lending, big box retail. We saw this after 9/11 and the recession in 2008, 2009. So we need to be vigilant and we need to be innovative because this is not over yet. There was a sense that somehow this was going to be logical and linear. We would go from response to restart. That's not happening. This is going to be choppy and volatile.
I want to ask you too, with all that talk, and Bruce, like you said, you've been working with federal government on this.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about philanthropic efforts too, though. Because Philadelphia also has its own COVID foundation or response fund, I should say, that it's set up. Is that something that's happening across? And how does that fill the void? Can that fill a void?
Well, before the federal government got its act together with the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program and so forth, what we were seeing around the country were cities were responding as quickly as possible. Local governments, public authorities, quasi-public corporations, philanthropies, business chambers. So all over the country, we have had local relief funds set up targeted to micro business and particularly targeted to minority-owned business and to disadvantaged neighborhoods. And they are able to allocate capital that's fit to purpose. They're really focused on the expenses of these firms and what they need. The challenge is they're oversubscribed and undercapitalized. So that's why we began to talk with members of the House and Senate about coming up with a relief act that would be targeting directly these kinds of underserved businesses and put the money in the hands of the cities, the counties, and philanthropic entities. So that's the Booker bill, so to speak. And we'll see if it makes it into the next act. If it doesn't, I'm really quite concerned whether cities and all the networks within cities really have the capital to respond to the gravity of this situation and the magnitude. This is a federal government moment. For most periods of time, the federal government doesn't do a lot. It allocates tremendous amount of resources, but it's been mired in partisan rancor and polarization for decades. This is a federal government moment. They really need to get their act together. And the Federal Reserve Bank Chairman Jerome Powell said yesterday, they need to have a stimulus package at scale that's fit to the reality of this crisis.
Harris, I want to get your take on the look of the city. And you've mentioned to me that you were already looking at changes to the Ben Franklin Parkway, for instance, that would make it more pedestrian and bicycle friendly, take a little bit of the emphasis off of the driving.
Mm-hmm.
And so talk to me a bit about your vision for the Parkway.
Yeah, so in 2013, we worked with Mike DeBardinis when he was Commissioner of Parks and Recreation in Philadelphia. He basically asked the question, now that we have fixed up the Parkway, this is when the Barnes moved in, and there had been about $20 million of state, city, and philanthropic money put into enhancing amenities, particularly for pedestrians and bikes along the Parkway. He said, okay, now we fixed it up, what do we want it to be? This is an absolutely, you've got an image up there on the screen. It's I think one of America, if not the world's kind of signature boulevards. It's an absolutely glorious vista, but on the ground, it's all about the cars. And so the question is, can we make this more pedestrian friendly? We did a number of public meetings, and one of the meetings yielded from the kind of citizens and working in groups, a name that became the name of the report, More Park, Less Way. So it's clear that the citizens wanted this to be more of a park, less of a highway. The oval that many people might recognize, which was a kind of creative placemaking strategy for Aikens Oval and the parking lot there that has been a great success over the past 6 or 7 summers put on by Parks and Rec with a number of different partners. It was basically a proof of concept that people would come to the middle of a traffic circle and actually enjoy themselves in the summer. So now the question is, can we make permanent improvements to the Parkway that will really shift that balance from cars and automobile traffic to more of a park? So this conversation was going on before pandemic landed in our laps. We're working with the folks at Parks and Rec to think about what this might mean. And some of the questions that have come up as we're putting together essentially kind of a game plan for Parks and Rec is, what is the implication of COVID on the redesign of the Parkway? Do we need surge spaces? Do we need sanitation spaces? Are there kind of other amenities that need to actually be built in, or are they flexible in ways that will allow the Parkway to function in the next pandemic? Which is really kind of, to me, what's more interesting. I think we can make the Parkway a great parkway. It will continue to be a beautiful boulevard, and we'll definitely make it more pedestrian friendly. But what we saw during the pandemic was a call to really turn over many of the lanes of the Parkway into public space. That people living in and around Center City did not have access to those kind of public spaces we talked about before, and the Parkway was seen as a major conduit that could get people from the city out to the park. Ironically, that's how the Parkway was originally created. So again, I stress the need for a much more comprehensive look at our public space system, trails that connect all of them so that people can get from dense parts of the cities out to these kind of breathing spaces on the edges. I think it brings up the issue of adding to Fairmount Park. We're currently looking at the future of 1,400 acres of the oil refinery, the one that went bankrupt last summer in the Lower Schuylkill, and doing some visioning for that. Significant amount of that site will be underwater in the next 50 to 100 years because of climate change and sea level rise. It begs the question, can we turn some of that into green infrastructure as an extension of Fairmount Park as part of this larger surge space? So I think there's a lot of good thinking that needs to go into not only the future of the Parkway, but ultimately the system we have that makes it much more equitable for people around the city during not only the next pandemic, but just daily life.
Well, Mayor Kenny told me a 2 weeks ago. I asked him about his very successful in the first 5 years, the free streets, which they opened up Broad Street the last couple of years, and before that, I think it was one of the other streets, whether it was Chestnut or Walnut. I mean, but they're not ready to do that, mostly because they have, he and his staff have so much going on, with the fiscal crisis. But is there a missed opportunity to take advantage of the 70-80% drop in car use and vehicular traffic in the city right now? And also, just to throw this out there too, Philadelphia has a reliance, I guess, historically on car use, and in places like South Philadelphia, Kevin, it really can, traffic is something else, and so is parking. So I just want to see, is there a way to move? How do we move on from that, or is there a way to move on for that? And where does that reluctance come from historically?
You want me to take that, or is it to Kevin?
I think Harris is better qualified than me on this one.
I mean, we all know about the tradition of parking down the middle of Broad Street, but I think that actually has been kind of slowly kind of grandfathered. Cities like Oakland and cities around the world have definitely taken this opportunity to create a network of streets that are open and free of cars, or at least they're shared streets, so that citizens can really surge out into these areas with a social distance to keep not only their spirits, but you need it, just to kind of get out of your apartments, particularly your houses if they're small and cramped. So I think Philadelphia has that opportunity. The Martin Luther King Drive has been open kind of throughout the pandemic, and I think in the early stages it was felt to be kind of a little too remote and people weren't getting there, but now they are. So yeah, it's all part of this network. We've got to kind of use what we have. We've got streets, we have old underused rail beds. It's an opportunity to grab that system for the future, or even for today, like you're saying. Oakland, I might have the statistic wrong, but has something like 70 miles of streets that are free and open to people to use for biking, walking, strolling, whatever. So I would certainly support that in terms of a strategy for Philadelphia today as well as in the future.
Bruce, I want to touch base again on the small business aspect of, and maybe very practically, you've explained a lot about what's happening on a big scale, which is and the federal government response. I thought before we move on to the next section, I wanted to see what could you tell small businesses that are watching that very practical, how to be more prepared for the next phase of this crisis and even the next crisis?
Well, to a large extent, what we're seeing is the relationship economy. Many of the large small businesses that got the initial Paycheck Protection Program loans from the federal government got them because they had favored relationships with large banks. So as small businesses are thinking of moving forward here, the question for each one of them is, who do you have in your network? Is it a community bank? Is it a community development finance institution? Is it a micro lender? Is it your business improvement district? Is it a community development corporation? Who do you have in your network? Is it part of the city government or the PIDC? The bottom line is small businesses survive as part of an ecosystem of capital. And I think what this crisis has shown is that the smallest of the small business, particularly Black-owned and Latino-owned, do not have the kind of networks that larger businesses have. So that would be my advice. Go find your network. And because if the Booker bill, for example, comes forward, that's going to flow through the city government, PIDC, and a whole network of neighborhood organizations. And the smaller businesses are more likely to get that capital, and it's more likely to be fit for purpose, frankly.
Well, we do have a few questions from the viewers, and so I would like to throw some of them at you. And it's Philadelphia, so it wouldn't be right without bringing up some sports reference. And I think sports in Philadelphia does seem to touch every aspect of our life. So the first question is a broad one about just to the group, what do each of you think about sports returning and how it would affect the sector of the economy and the community that you guys each are experts in?
Well, if there's any guide, they're already the German Bundesliga soccer league there is already resuming play, but with no one in the stands. So they're televised, but you cannot attend in person. We'll see how that plays out. We can watch, how that works, and if it does, then that could, perhaps help inform us. I think it'd be great for morale. I can only stream so many movies on Netflix. I wouldn't mind watching a game or two once in a while. So I think we should, take that cue. And as I like to say, the way we're going to get out of this is not a light switch. It's not on and off. We're going to suddenly return to normal. It's a dimmer switch, right? And moreover, as Bruce said, it's not only non-linear, but it's also going to be at a non-constant rate of speed. There'll be stops and goes as we proceed. So, start the games, see, if the rate of infection rises. If it doesn't, maybe you can let, a third of the stands be filled. And if nothing happens, then you can increasingly dial it up. And if the rate of infection does grow, then dial it back and go back to just televising the games without allowing attendance. So, like I said, it's going to be a stop and go nonlinear process.
I always sit in the nosebleed section, so no one's ever there anyway. Maybe they'll let me in.
I would say that it's a comparable question around children's sports. I think one of the things that we're feeling so strongly is children really need to run around. They need to let off speed, but they also need the discipline of how to control all that steam, and that comes through sports. And there's a lot of concern about how do we begin to bring children back into organized play. And there have been some sort of interesting early conversations about, small cohorts, have small teams working together, have them be in the same grouping week after week, have them take their temperatures. And if one of them gets sick, they all just back off and don't play for 2 weeks. But I think people are really trying to think not just about the professional sports, but we need our children back playing. We need the physical activity, and we need the learning that comes from group activity. And that's going to be the same process, dialing up, dialing down, finding a way of making that safe again for children.
Yeah, and we see it just, I live out here in Mount Airy along the Wissahick, and just the amount of people have been coming out to the park to be on the trails. I mean, it's, I know that they're not local because they're looking on their phone in terms of trying to get a trailhead. So clearly I could probably sell lemonade if I was allowed to, but the evidence is there that, and it's normal, it's human. People need to get out and about, and they need to get active, whether it's in groups or individually. There's a lot more people on the streets and a lot coming from different parts of the city.
Yeah, it is amazing how many people you see in the Wissahickon now, because that's our green space up here in the north. More now than before the pandemic.
Oh my good, yeah.
Lucy, it's not just the kids that need the exercise. Adults need it too. And for those of us that don't have access to the Wissahickon, we need to blow off some steam by getting into a drunken fist fight with a Cowboys fan. So I think sports eventually.
Exactly.
You can do that at McManamans.
So. Another question, and this has to do with business and its effect on the economy. With the food service industry representing roughly 10% of the economy, has any focused thinking been applied to how restaurants can reopen and function at a profitable level?
I think the most entrepreneurial restaurants have moved to sort of takeout and curbside, but frankly, that doesn't cover the revenues that they were receiving before. I think we're going to start moving to more cooperative models, which are more of a Northern European model. So if you think about a main street or a commercial corridor or bits of the downtown, or even bits around universities and other anchors, what you may see is that small businesses begin to come together, not each small business by itself going to a financial institution for a particular loan or working capital or to get access to grants and so forth, but organizing almost like a guild of restaurants in a particular area, supported and buttressed by these regenerator kind of intermediaries that we're describing. So I don't think this is going to look like it did before, but Philly is a foodie town. And everyone is having like serious withdrawal right now. So there's
a lot of takeout going on. There's a lot of takeout.
No, yeah.
It's going to come back, but I think the models are more going to come out of Denmark and Holland and Germany than out of what we're used to in the U.S. We have some of this already with farmer markets and with certain
CSAs.
kind of historic central markets.
Yeah.
But this is going to become more of a model, and it's going to change financing, and it's going to change essentially these more collective kind of intermediaries that we have in the United States.
Well, Bruce, you and Jeremy wrote The New Localism, which was really about finance and governance. But in many ways, that could read down to how we organize ourselves in neighborhoods, right? Because it's ultimately, what can we walk to? How can we make sure we can get, have a supply chain, right? That we're not dependent on California or Chile or whatever for our produce. So I think that there's this opportunity to rethink that new localism at the ground level.
I think also this has an enormous effect on what Lucy was talking about, because wealth building in the United States relates to owning a business or owning a home. And if what we're going to begin to move towards is really the revenge of the large, large big box, large speculative absentee landlords, we're going to diminish the ability for large numbers of people to grow their incomes and build assets for their families.
Right.
We already have enormous racial and ethnic disparities, and Philadelphia, among big cities, has the highest poverty rate. That's going to get worse in the near term, and we're going to need these different kind of models or interventions to mitigate the damage and then come back.
Well, COVID's impact disproportionately on the minority communities anyhow. I mean, it has just exposed, that from the get-go.
Yeah. And not only in incidence, but in severity.
Exactly.
So, I mean, we're seeing it at every level. It's a huge concern, obviously.
The third question we have has to do with something Kevin, you've gone into it a lot already, but I think it is something that so many people are thinking about. So maybe there's a little room to expand a little bit on it. The question itself is, how do you see the potential for lower demand or the reduction of current space for commercial space for companies that have discovered the possibility for employees working to work from home? But I think, like I said, you've talked a lot about that, but it's a good question because, maybe it lends itself to people living anywhere they want to, not only working wherever they want, but living wherever they want. So I just, just again, what is how do you see the effect of work from home on society and Philadelphia and cities like Philadelphia?
Now we only have 10 minutes left. Well, there's an old joke that the definition of an economist is a guy who can correctly predict 8 out of the last 3 recessions, right? So it's kind of like the whole thing with the death of cities. It's been they've been predicted 9 out of the last 4 times. Normally, I would say I would remain bullish, but there's 2 big unknowns in the equation. One is, first of all, how will workers react? Would they be willing to return, to high density office settings after this is over? In the past, they have. Like I said, the last pandemic 100 years ago hit us really hard, but remember, it came on the tail end of the worst war in human history. We lost millions. They were resilient people. They had been through World War I. They got through the pandemic. It was not as bad. This time around, I don't know if workers, we've become a more risk-averse people as a society. And the second variable in the equation is, well, how will the management react to this, not the workers? Will they discover that the savings from having most of their workforce work from home exceed the benefits of agglomeration, that is, people being in the same space? And we'll move towards a model where most of your lower-level workers work from home and only senior management works in the office because, so much of their work has to take place in meetings and in-person negotiations, court appearances, things like that. So those are the 2 big unknowns. So like I said, normally I would think cities would be resilient, but one thing I can predict is, what will happen? Well, I can confidently predict we're going to find out.
I haven't thought about that unless Bruce wants to kind of jump in from the small business perspective.
Well, I do think, just really quickly, I think if 08-09 was about the collapse of single family housing and large transfers of distressed properties to urban land banks and so forth, I think this crisis is going to move an enormous amount of commercial real estate into public ownership. And then again, we should be looking to Denmark and to Sweden and to Finland for how they have managed after their economic shocks to dispose of public assets in very strategic ways. I mean, everyone talks about how wonderful Copenhagen is and so forth, but they've managed over 30 years after a manufacturing crisis to rebuild their waterfront and take the revenues from that to build one of the most modern transit systems in the world. We've got to start adapting proven models from other parts of the world, Singapore, et cetera. So that's what may come out of this, but it's going to be brutal. I think we need to have our eyes open about how deep this crisis is going to be.
So Bruce, I asked my students to look at the Ørsted model for the Lower Schuylkill that you had recommended. I mean, I think there's definitely some potential there. Let me just one quick thing. So, not an economist, but I remember. I don't know if it's going back to the 90s or certainly early 2000s. Paul Levy in the Center City District did a study called something like "Turn the Lights On Upstairs," and basically a lot of Center City, the second floors above the retail were empty because of recessions and flight and all the kind of stuff we know about. That study and the subsequent implementation of it brought people living above the stores and along in the streets of Center City, and really contributed to part of the renaissance and rebirth of Center City. So I think this crisis, depending on where it goes and what's left and how we can imagine using it, there's going to be opportunities for us to rethink how we as a society live, work, and play, given the assets that are hard and fixed, they're not going to move, and we've got to be creative about it.
So can I just jump in with one final thought around this, which is the economy actually is not going to open up until we solve the education problem. Until we figure out what to do with childcare and with school and with summer camp, a significant number of working families are not going to be able to go to work. They're just not going to be able to go back to work because they're going to be at home with their children. So I mean, the other side of this is that we have now learned that childcare is essential because a lot of people are working at home trying to figure out what to do with those 2- and 3-year-olds. Mm-hmm. And we have not figured out what social distancing in a childcare center looks like. What drop off for a 2-year-old who has got, attachment problems is actually
touching their face all the time.
Exactly. So a lot of people are working at home, and the assumption is that their children are going to be someplace else. And until we really get childcare stabilized, those small businesses, by the way, Bruce, the small business, childcare is famously unstable as a small business, and
Absolutely.
A lot of stuff moved apart. Until the childcare infrastructure is strengthened, until we work that out, until the K-12 system is back and running, until we've got summer camp, the fact is the economy, people over 50 and under 27 may go back to work, but folks with children are not. So all of these systems are connected to each other. And the truth is we have no idea how any of this is going to happen, but it all has to be solved. And as Kevin said, it's going to go up and down and in and out, and we're going to learn and we're going to change. But
this is where the co-op model may be really useful also.
Maybe where a co-op model is useful, right?
Yeah.
And absolutely, Lucy, I'm absolutely one of the people you just described. I have an 8-year-old daughter. My wife is a full-time mom and homemaker. I'm working from home. And, once the school year ends, my wife is dreading what to do because I have to work. I can't have the kid playing with the dog all the time in the background while trying to run regression models and do interviews, sessions with fine people like you. And my wife said, she can't go hiking in the Wissahickon with the kid and the dog for 8 hours every day, So we don't know what we're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I wish we had time for a couple more questions because this has been great. I think, though, I want to just move on to, why don't I get some final thoughts from each of you, because we only have a couple minutes left. Just in your realm, what do you think practically that the future of cities is going to look like as we move forward?
I'll start because mine is quick. I think we are going to have to solve for internet access. And we are going to have to figure out how to provide universal internet access at a fast enough speed so that families can operate remotely. That's what it looks like to me.
I think it's a great opportunity for Philadelphia as well as other cities to address issues of their attractiveness. I think they need to enact some reforms that send the signal that if you're willing to commit, to Philadelphia, Philadelphia is willing to commit to you. Like I said, doing a significant tax reform. I think we could think about having a transfer tax holiday for people moving into Philadelphia on the purchase and sale of real estate, having a wage tax abatement for new workers, much like our real estate tax abatement, addressing the issue of prevailing wages for city and state funded projects, which drive up the development costs in order to get development going again. As I like to say, we're a city, we have New York construction costs, but we have Baltimore rents and prices. And addressing that gap, I think, would be good. Having expedited building permits, zoning variances, again, anything that sends the signal that if you're willing to commit to Philadelphia, Philadelphia is willing to commit to you. Other cities could follow the same thing. Lastly, you know what has 2 thumbs and doesn't bet against Philadelphia or cities? This guy.
No, I would just say that, in the United States, we celebrate small business. We almost mythologize small business. Now's the time to create business models and, frankly, new kinds of financial products, not just debt, but equity investments in local serving small businesses so that we can build assets and build wealth. So we need a surge of innovation in the small business ecosystem within Philadelphia and across the United States.
So I've asked my students to look at the future of the Lower Schuylkill. Excuse me a second, let me decline that. Sorry. Future of the Lower Schuylkill, the oil refinery site, 1,400 acres, we talked about a little earlier, kind of through the lens of the COVID crisis. What have we learned and how can we use that as a laboratory for renewal and rebuilding? And they're looking at it through the lens of environmental justice, and they're talking about equity and food security. So I think that there'll be some interesting ideas that come out of that I'd love to explore further.
Well, thanks, guys, very much. Really, it's been a great hour.
Our pleasure.
It was as fun as I thought it was going to be.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, guys. So to our viewers out there, thanks a lot for joining us, and thanks again to Harris, Bruce, Lucy, and Kevin, and the entire Lindy Institute at Drexel. Hopefully we can do this again.
We'd love it. We're here. We're not going anywhere.
Yeah, where we go.
We're not doing anything else.
Exactly.
Well, thanks again, guys. I'm Brian McCrone with NBC10 Digital, and thanks again for joining us.
That's terrific.